Good afternoon everybody. Good afternoon, habari za mchana. Najua tumetoka kwenye chakula na system ya mwili ikianza kulainisha chakula kunakuwa na usingizi kidogo. Kwa hiyo tutajitahidi tuliwapa mbele yenu tuwachangamshe msisinzie. Karibuni sana. So I'll be chairing this session and my name is Francis Majiga and I'm the Executive Director for Tanzania Private Sector Foundation, TPSF. We have 3 presenters and 3 topics. The first topic says the role of Parliament in democratic consolidation. Are they representatives and protectors of the people, their needs and aspirations? And this will be presented by Professor Ransford Gyampo. The second topic is on African bureaucracies. Are they parasites or effective champions of inclusive development? This will be presented by Dr. Matrona, Kabyemela. And the third topic is on standing up to the African Leviathan state, civil society, and the challenges of speaking truth to power. This will be presented by Madam Henga. So I tried to do a slight translation of these topics in Swahili. I understand Swahili is our national language, and I did as follows. Topic ya kwanza, nafasi ya bunge katika kuimarisha demokrasia. Mabunge au wabunge ni wawakilishi na walinzi wa raia na mahitaji na matamanio yao. Topic ya kwanza niweza kuitafsiri hivyo, inawezekana sio sahihi sana lakini angalau inawasilisha ujumbe. Na topic ya pili kwa Kiswahili niweza kuitafsiri kama je, serikali na tawala za Kiafrika ni wanyonyaji au champions wa maendeleo sahihi au maendeleo tarajiwa na ya uhakika wa wananchi wake. Na tatu, kusimama imara dhidi ya au kukataa maguvu ya watawala au maguvu ya serikali. Na hapa maelezo zaidi itakuwa je, ugumu kwa jamii kuziambia ukweli serikali zetu. Kumekuwa na tendency ya wananchi kushindwa kufika mahala wakashindwa kuziambia serikali zao matatizo au mama ambayo yanawasibu. Na hili ataliongelea dada yangu Henga. Kwa hiyo kwa ufupi hayo ndivyo mazungumzo yetu ya sasa hivi. Hii session ambayo inafuata, na without further ado I would like to invite Professor Ransford Gyampo to take the stage. Welcome, Prof. Thank you.
Good afternoon. This is the 3rd time of my coming to Tanzania, and I must say I'm a bit embarrassed that I'm still not able to speak Kiswahili. I promise to take the language very seriously, so that the next time here I'll be able to communicate in the official lingua franca. But for now, permit me to...
Sorry, Prof. We have only 45 minutes of our session, so please, if you can go faster. Sorry to interfere.
Yes, please. And that was the next challenge I was going to talk about. The time is too short. I was told I was going to be given 20 minutes. I got here, and they said 10 minutes, so it becomes a bit problematic, but we'll see what we'll do. All right, so I'm speaking to the topic, the role of Parliament in democratic consolidation, and I realize that it's been tweaked a little bit, asking further questions, which we may leave during the question and answer. We may interrogate during the question and answer series. Now, wherever and whenever a people put a government in place, there is always the need for a body that will supervise and control the activities of the government that may have been so instituted. It would be ideal if the whole people could discharge this supervisory role directly by themselves. However, since it is next to impossibility to exercise a strict and specialized popular control and supervision, there is always the need for a special representative institution to do so on behalf of the people. This institution, as we know, is the institution we call Parliament. In terms of structure, as you may be aware, there are two main types, the unicameral and bicameral parliaments. I must also indicate that there is a third type, the tricameral parliament, which used to exist in apartheid South Africa. Again, in terms of purposes, there are two main types. These are the unitary and federal. But there is also a third, confederal, which is now very rare in the modern world. In terms of functions, there are four main functions that can be looked at. The first one is representation. The representative function of Parliament is the basis of its legitimacy. Parliament is said to be legitimately constituted only when it is truly representative of the people on whose behalf it acts. The second function of Parliament is legislation or lawmaking. Parliament all over the world is the organ of government that has a formal power to make laws for administering a country. It must, however, be noted, as we may all be aware, that there is an increasing trend towards the sharing of the legislative function by other arms of government, mainly the executive arm of government, through delegated legislations, and sometimes through the judiciary, through the application of case laws or precedents, and the power to give statutory interpretation to laws. So one can therefore say that technically, even though the power to make law falls within the domain of the legislative or arm of government or Parliament, other arms of government, particularly the executive and the judiciary, also play a role in the lawmaking function of Parliament. The third function is Parliament's power to control the expenditure of the state or the finances of the state. And it is on the strength of this that all budgetary estimates of government are sent to Parliament to be debated before approval. The development of parliamentary powers in this regard, to a large extent, stems from the original role of the British House of Commons as a body which had to give its consent to the taxes which the Crown needed to maintain itself. Last but not the least, the fourth function of Parliament is to control the formulation of policies. The executive branch of government in a truly democratic state must compulsorily submit a list of its general policies to Parliament for debate, scrutiny, criticisms, or approval. In the US, this is called the State of the Union Address. Elsewhere, it is simply called sessional address. Now, if these are the role of Parliament, how do these roles lead to the consolidation of any democracy? But first, what is democratic consolidation? There are several scholars who have written extensively about democratic consolidation, but because of time, I would not go through all of them. But suffice it to say that for Gasiorowski and Power, democratic consolidation connotes an acceptable qualitative improvement in democratic practices. If you look at the works of Crawford and Abdullahi, they also argued that a country achieves democratic consolidation when no individual or groups seriously attempt to overthrow the democratic regime or secede from the state, and when the overwhelming majority of the people believe that any further political change must emerge not from one person, but from within the parameters of democratic formulas. So on the basis of the liberal conceptualization of democratic consolidation, it can be gleaned that when a democracy is fully consolidated, it does not suffer the threat of relapse into authoritarianism. In this regard, elections in a properly democratically consolidated country are seamless and do not assume a do or die posture. The executive arm of government in countries where democracy is consolidated is headed by the president, oftentimes wielding enormous powers. But these powers are checked, they are bridled or they are shackled in a manner that ensures that the president does not become a political King Kong, wielding all powers and attempting to relapse the democratic gains of the country into authoritarianism. So the need to check the exercise of powers to prevent democratic relapse into authoritarianism is instructive because, as Lord Acton argued, power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolutely. And so you would always have to have a certain power that will check the exercise of powers that are exercised by the executive arm of government so that the executive arm of government does not relapse into dictatorship. So how does Parliament play any role to ensure democratic consolidation? To play a role in consolidating a country's democratic gains, Parliament, in my view, must radically move away from its disingenuous function of rubber-stamping virtually all decisions emanating from the executive arm of government. Playing a role of rubber stamp, as many parliaments in Africa do, expands the frontiers of the powers of the executive arm of government rather than checking or curtailing them. To consolidate democracy in Africa, Parliament must therefore necessarily play a role to serve as a countervailing authority to the powers of the executive arm of government. The idea of countervailing authority, which is Lockean in origin, simply connotes the existence of an independent power, like the power of Parliament, to counter the exercise of another power, like the power of the executive arm of government. So if Parliament plays an independent role to counter the exercise of power in any polity, the executive arm of government would be adequately kept on its toes, and the president will be effectively checked in the exercise of his or her powers to prevent the relapse of democracy into dictatorship and authoritarianism. To this end, where Parliament, whether operating in a parliamentary system of government where it is separated from the executive arm of government, or in a presidential system of government where it is fused with the executive, must play a fierce role in shoring up the democratic gains of a country by putting the interests of constituents and the country first and ensuring that powers vested in the presidency are accountably used.
Professor, you have 3 minutes. Thank you.
3 minutes.
Yes.
Again, Parliament can be effective in playing its role as countervailing authority to the powers of the executive and by extension promote democratic consolidation when it eschews the needless and excessive partisanship in its activities in the House where it operates. In many African democracies, the plague of excessive partisanship tends to blindfold many parliamentarians and prevent them from seeing and debating issues purely from objective perspectives. In their debates, they tend to be overly partisan and are therefore caught in the quagmire of being overly supportive of the executive or overly opposing of the government in a manner that weakens their leverage or expected leverage and their countervailing powers that they are expected to wield over the executive arm of government. Also, Parliament can play its role in consolidating democracy when elections to Parliament are shaped more by competence, achievement, knowledge, and less by popularity. Unfortunately, in many African democracies, elections and their outcomes are shaped by popularity. Hence, parliaments and parliamentary seats tend to be occupied in many African democracies by people who are less educated, ignorant, and lack what it takes to assert themselves and the powers of parliament over the executive arm of government. And the situation is quite complicated in many African democracies where parliamentarians do not have offices and research assistants to seize them with relevant research information to help their role in parliament. The executive is therefore able to bulldoze its way through parliament, with many parliamentarians either offering blind support or remaining quiet because of their inability to appreciate or grasp many of the issues discussed. Lastly, Parliament can also play a more meaningful role in keeping the executive arm of government in check and by extension preventing democratic relapse into authoritarianism when it is given more resources to do its work. In many African democracies, once again, the power to control the public purse by Parliament is not fully discharged. Parliamentarians debate and approve huge sums of money to be spent by the executive, but the amount of money allocated to Parliament for the performance of their role pales in comparison to that of the executive. With easy access to financial and other expertise human resources, the executive arm of government is able to assert more tremendous influence in a manner that makes it quite difficult for Parliament to effectively check the exercise of powers of the executive. So I'll conclude by saying that I want to reiterate the role of Parliament in democratic consolidation. And this lies in Parliament's ability to assert its independence in serving as a check over the exercise of powers of the executive arm of government. Without this, the executive will become overly powerful and will soon degenerate into dictatorship and authoritarianism. However, a consolidated democracy does not entertain the fear of democratic relapse into authoritarianism. So, in order not to entertain this fear, Parliament must eschew excessive partisanship in the conduct of its business. It must ensure that its members have the requisite education, knowledge, and information needed to carry out their parliamentary duties, and it must be given adequate financial and other needed resources to enable it undertake an independent role as a countervailing authority to the powers of the executive. Where there is an independent and adequate power to counter the exercise of power in a polity, it becomes difficult for democracy to relapse into authoritarianism. It will necessarily be consolidated. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor. Thank you so much for a very, very powerful presentation. You've done it quite well within 10 minutes. And some of the key takeaways are the roles of the Parliament, but most importantly, how they should conduct themselves. Just a few takeaways. Ametuambia kwamba wabunge au bunge liache kuwa rubber stamp. Kile kinacholetwa wanapitisha, kinacholetwa wanapitishwa. Waache tabia. Lakini cha pili, chaguzi za wabunge zifanyike vizuri. Sio kwa upendeleo, lakini kupatana uwezo. Watu wenye uwezo ndio waweze kuingia bungeni. Lakini na tatu, akasema kwamba mabunge yawezeshwe, yapewe pesa ya kutosha ili waweze kufanya kazi zao kwa uhuru bila kuingiliwa. Kwa ufupi ndio ambao nimeweza kuyachukua. Thank you so much. Very nice presentation. I now go to the second presenter. That is Dr. Matrona Kabyemela. Serikali tawala au watawala wa Kiafrika ni wanyonyaji ama ni wale ambao wanatetea maendeleo ya wananchi kwa uhakika? Karibu dada.
Good evening. My presentation will be on African public bureaucracies. Are they parasites or effective champions of inclusive development? I have decided to use an historical approach in defining, in answering this question. And maybe before I jump into giving you my position, I want to take you through the meaning of public bureaucracies as far as this presentation is concerned. Public bureaucracies are special administrative agencies that are used by the government to carry out its responsibilities. So these public bureaucracies are involved in planning, decision-making, advising, coordination, negotiation, etc., etc. According to Scott, bureaucratic organizations have certain features, and these are clear. There should be clear division of labor, high lack of officers, rules and regulation to guide decision-making, clear separation of collective property from personal property, and the selection of officials on merit basis, so that to make these organizations work for the interest of the people. For the purpose of time, I want you to note some of important things. The first thing that I have noticed as I was going through different research is that public bureaucracies are the one which are involved in authoritative allocation of values in the society, including development. But again, it is important to note that public bureaucracies are part and parcel of the political system of the time. So they are not independent of the politics, though they are not supposed to be influenced by the politics of the time. But again, as far as African public bureaucracies is concerned, they were inherited or adopted from the colonial government without adaptation. So we adopted these bureaucracies without adaptation. So back to the historical perspective, that will show us if these public bureaucracies are champions of development or they are parasites. Now, during the colonial time, the focus of the state and therefore the political system was on colonization. And therefore, the activities during that time were pacification of the territories, collection of taxes, maintenance of law and order. And actually, therefore, bureaucrats of this time came in contact with the people as tax collectors, forced labor enforcers, prosecutors, judge and jury in the colonial court. So the issue here, it was not on social and economic development rather than on exploitation, and this influenced the way public bureaucracies during this time behaved, and therefore it was not there for the citizens, it was there for the colonial government, and therefore we can say during this time these public bureaucracies were parasites rather than champions.
5 minutes to go. Thank you.
So post-independence,
Yes, 5 minutes. 5 minutes to go. Thank you.
during this time, again, the nature of the state did not change. It remained decentralized, and actually the ruling party were very strong, and therefore the focus of the state was self-maintenance on power. So the agenda of development was taken over by self-maintaining on the power. So the rulers were maintaining the power. They were very happy that now they are on power, they cannot go. So the role of the bureaucracies during this time was to make sure the state and the rulers remain on power. And therefore, and if you read Mkandala 2002, on his article, To Be or Not to Be, the paradox of African public bureaucracies, is saying that public bureaucracies during this time were used for the interest of the rulers. There were no such much changes. The self-maintenance by using force in some countries, they also control the elections to make sure the ruling system or the incumbent is winning at 99% to tell the world that they are popular and legitimate. So, for example, the bureaucrats were loyal to the ruling system and the ruling party. Now, because of time, let us look at the period of reform. In 1980s, we encountered a difficult time in terms of economy decline, and now we were told to reform our public bureaucracies, to reduce its size, to train our public bureaucracies, but also to have strong institutions, because it was said the crisis was also caused by these bureaucracies. Now the question, did these reforms change African bureaucracies to become effective champions of inclusive development? Not at all. Why? Because the nature of the state has not much changed, and therefore the bureaucracies are still working within the same context. For example, Claudiac 2000 says the problem is not that those who serve the public are corrupt, unpatriotic, and prone to press public office into serving their interest. The real problem is that the public which is being served and the state which embodies it is at best rudimentary and not universal, rather than aggregation of particularities. It is the state that has turned society into its enemy, politics into warfare, and therefore the behavior of public bureaucracies, such as abuse of public offices, breaking administrative law, bribes, may be taken as rational, as long as it helps those in power to remain there. Now, some anecdotal evidences. We have seen that most of top officials are appointed by the president, and therefore they are likely manipulated by the president for the purpose of self-maintenance on power. But again, the top civil servants have good connection with the ruling class, sometimes from the same village or region. This also is a problem. We also see that the top officials live in capital cities with the very well-furnished houses, ready transport, leaving the peasant in the poor far away in the village.
1 minute, 1 minute, please.
So, But again, we have seen rampant corruption. There is a crisis of ethics in public bureaucracies. Now, maybe to conclude, because of time, there are several proposed ways on how we can improve African public bureaucracies. Most of them are talking about the strengthening the institutions so that to regulate their behavior. But for me, from the analysis and from the readings that I have done, I think we need to have our own way of organizing public bureaucracies in Africa. Remember, we adopted without adapting these bureaucracies. And therefore, I'm thinking that we should have bureaucracies that will take care of values, culture, practices, not necessarily the bureaucracies organized along Weberian model. We should think of ours. We have our good things that were not accommodated in these public bureaucracies we adopted. So we need to think of these good things that can be accommodated so that to make these public bureaucracies contextual. So you have people owning the state, but again, owning these bureaucracies, and actually, if we are thinking of that, this should go hand in hand with reforming the state to make it look like our context. So, Mr. Chair, that is the end of my presentation.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Dr. Matrona Kabyemela. I think that was a very powerful, again, another powerful presentation. And the key takeaways from what you have said is that bureaucracies in Africa are part and parcel of our political framework, and therefore don't expect much. But also in terms of concluding that we need to develop our own bureaucracies based on our values, culture, tradition, and our way of life. Thank you so much. Let me invite the third presenter, that is Madam Anna Henga, standing up to the African Leviathan. Karibu.
Asante sana. Naomba niongee Kiswahili, lingua franca ya Afrika, kama tulivyoambiwa na Waziri Kabudi jana. Topic ambayo nitaenda kuijadili, Kiswahili chake mwenyekiti wa session hii amekisema vizuri kwamba ni kusimama imara dhidi ya maguvu ya serikali au serikali tata na changamoto. Mimi sisemi ugumu, changamoto za asasi za kiraia wanaposema ukweli. Sasa mimi ni kiongozi wa asasi ya kiraia ambayo huwa inasema ukweli sana. Kwa hiyo wakati naandaa hii paper nilikosa pa kusoma, baada yake nikawa nakumbuka tu practical experience yangu. Kwa hiyo nitashare zaidi practical experience au jinsi ambavyo tunavyoenda, yani mwenendo wetu. Labda kwa kwanza tu niseme asasi za kiraia manake nini, au civil society manake nini. Ninaposema civil society ni kwamba civil society au asasi za kiraia maana yake ni sekta ya tatu ambayo sio serikali wala sio biashara, na inahusiana na makundi ya watu waliokuja pamoja kwa ajili ya kuwa na agenda fulani. Wana agenda yao au wana jambo lao fulani, kwa hiyo wanakaa pamoja kwa ajili ya kulifanya ile swala liweze kutimia. Na mara nyingi tukisikia asasi za kiraia tunawafikiria Legal and Human Rights Center, Tanzania Women Lawyers na kadhalika, lakini kumbe hata kwenye familia kuna asasi za kiraia. Kuna asasi za kiraia za familia. Nasema sisi ni ukoo wa Henga, tunakaa pamoja, tunachanga, tunazikana na tunakufa na kuzikana. Zote hizo ni asasi za kiraia. Kwa asasi za kiraia ziko za aina nyingi sana. Asasi za kiraia ziko za kidini, pia na asasi za kiraia. Zipo za wajasiriamali wadogo wadogo, kiacha biashara na makampuni. Asasi za kiraia pia kuna wakati mimi nimebahatika kusoma masters ambayo inahusiana na asasi za kiraia, Practice for Civil Society. Tulikuwa kuna ubishani pia hata vyama vya siasa, je, ni asasi za kiraia au sio asasi za kiraia? Zamani vilianza kama vyama vya wakulima, vyama vya wafanyakazi, baadaye vikaja vikaibuka vikawa vyama vya kisiasa. Kwa hiyo pia hiyo ilikuwa ni changamoto. Kuna shule mbili za mawazo kati watu wanasema kwamba vyama vya kisiasa na asasi za kiraia au sio asasi za kiraia, kwa sababu baadaye ikija kuingia kwenye uongozi, kwa mfano Chama cha Mapinduzi au tuseme chama cha tano kilianza kama taka manini, baadaye kikapanda mpaka kama chama cha kisiasa. Kwenye chama cha kisiasa pale baadaye kikashika dola, kishashika dola kinaacha tena kuwa asasi ya kiraia. Kwa hiyo kuna swala hilo pia. Sasa kwa Tanzania asasi za kiraia ambapo tunazifahamu, kuna NGOs. NGOs ni aina mojawapo ya asasi ya kiraia, au azise, asasi zisizo za kiserikali, hiyo ni NGO. Na pia kuna asasi za kijamii au community based organizations, kuna vikundi, kuna wakfu mbalimbali, kuna vyama vya wasomi labda kama Tanganyika Law Society kwa mfano, labda bodi ya wahasibu, kuna asasi za kidini kama nilivyosema, kuna trade unions, vyama vya wafanyakazi pia na asasi za kiraia. Kuna vikundi vya kusaidiana wao kwa sisi, Kikoba group sio na nini, hizo ni asasi za kiraia. Kuna asasi za kibiashara kama nilivyosema hapo awali kwamba sisi wafanya biashara wa soko la Kariakoo tunakaa pamoja, tunatetea haki zetu za biashara. Hiyo ni asasi ya kiraia. Lakini pia kuna mitandao mbalimbali pamoja na makundi mbalimbali ya uchechemuzi au advocacy groups. Sasa asasi za kiraia zimegawanyika katika aina mbili. Kuna asasi ya kiraia inayotoa huduma moja kwa moja, na kuna asasi ya kiraia ambayo inatetea, inafanya utetezi, service organization vis-a-vis advocacy organizations. Sasa service organizations ni zile ambazo kwa mfano zinatoa huduma moja kwa moja labda ya kiafya, ya kijamii. Kwa mfano labda wanachimba visima, labda wanagawa madaftari mashuleni, labda wanatoa vifaa tiba kwa watu wenye ulemavu, au wanajenga mashule na kadhalika. Kwa mfano kuna asasi moja inaitwa World Vision ambayo ina makao Arusha, natoa mfano tu. Wale wanachimba visima, wanasema wao wanamhudumia mtoto, lakini katika kumhudumia mtoto lazima uwe na jamii, kwa sababu mtoto anatoka kwenye jamii. Kwa hiyo hawampi mtoto moja kwa moja, bali wanaipa jamii yake inayomzunguka mtoto. Kwa hiyo
una dakika 5, asante.
Kwa hiyo wanajenga shule alipo mtoto ili wazazi wake pia wafaidi, wasimpeleke mtoto mbali sana. Wanajenga kisima ili jamii inayomzunguka ipate maji inayomzunguka yule mtoto. Sasa nimeambiwa na dakika 5, ngoja nimalize. Kwa hiyo advocacy organizations au za utetezi ni kama taasisi ninayosimamia mimi, Legal and Human Rights Center, kwamba sisi hatutoi fedha, hatutoi kitu chochote, bali tunatetea haki za watu. Kwa sasa hizi asasi za utetezi ndio zenye matatizo, ndio ambazo zinaingia matatani mara nyingi, kwa sababu unaambiwa unachangia nini wewe katika uchumi wa nchi, au unaongea tu unachangia kitu gani? Sasa ndio waga zinapata matatizo, na hasa zile ambazo zinatetea haki ya kisiasa na kiraia. Makundi ya haki za binadamu yako matatu: civil and political rights, siasa na raia; haki ya kiuchumi, kijamii na kiutamaduni, economic, social, cultural rights; na group rights ni kundi la tatu. Kwa hiyo ukitetea tu civil and political rights, you in trouble. Ndio changamoto mojawapo. Sasa hebu tuziseme hizi changamoto kwa haraka kwa dakika chache zilizobaki. Changamoto ya kwanza ni kufananishwa na upinzani. Na vyama vya upinzani, na kufananishwa kwamba asasi za kiraia wanatetea chama fulani cha upinzani. Sana. Kwa hiyo ile kufananishwa, unashindwa kuwatetea watu wengine kwa sababu unaonekana wewe ni mpinzani. Kitu kingine ni kuambiwa kwamba asasi za kiraia zimetumwa na wazungu, zimetumwa na mataifa ya nje kuja Tanzania kwa ajili ya kuchochea amani ya nchi isiwepo na kadhalika. Changamoto ya 4 ni kuitwa wachochezi, kwamba hivi nyinyi hamwezi kunyamaza jamani, mbona mnachochea sana? Hamwezi kutulia, mnachochea amani jamani. Kwa hiyo ile kuitwa wachochezi. Kwa hiyo ajenda yetu nyingine zikawa nzuri sana, lakini tunaitwa wachochezi. Lakini nyingine ambayo ni extreme sasa ni kwamba kuna asasi za kiraia ambazo zinafungiwa kabisa. Kuna moja wenzetu walifungiwa akaunti zao zikafungwa kabisa. Yaani hawezi kufanya kazi. Kishafungiwa akaunti huwezi kufanya kazi. Huwezi kuwasha gari kwenda kutetea mtu, huwezi kwenda mahakamani, huwezi kwenda wapi, kwa hiyo akaunti zikafungwa. Lakini kuna asasi nyingine zilifutwa kabisa. Na mitandao ilifutwa kabisa. Sisi tulikuwa tunasimamia mtandao unaitwa Taseo, ulifutwa kabisa. Japo upo unasuasua umeanza kusimama kidogo. Kwa hiyo hiyo ni changamoto nyingine. Lakini changamoto nyingine ni kunyimwa vibali vya kufanya kazi. Unanyimwa kibali cha kusimamia uchaguzi ambao ni kidemokrasia, lazima uchaguzi uangaliwe na waangalizi wa uchaguzi. Kwa asasi za ambazo zina foreigners ambazo zina watu kutoka nje, kunyimwa vibali vya kazi deliberately, kunyimwa kabisa. Kwa hiyo ni changamoto. Lakini nyingine ni kukamatwa. Mimi na staff wangu ambaye alikaa mwaka, anaitwa Tito Magoti, alikaa mwaka gerezani kwa sababu tu alitoa maoni yake kwa njia ya mtandao. Kwa hiyo kuna kukamatwa, kuwekwa ndani, kufungwa. Mimi mwenyewe nishatishiwa sana. Kwa hiyo hivyo hizo ni changamoto ambazo asasi za kiraia tunazipata. Labda mwenyekiti dakika moja hiyo. Nitoe mfano mmoja tu kwamba changamoto ambazo asasi za kiraia zinaipata pia kwa kusema ule ukweli ni kunyimwa uhuru wa kufanya kazi. Kuna wakati tunasema kwamba niseme ukweli niendelee kuishi au ninyamaze, ninyamaze niendelee kuishi au niseme ukweli nijilipue alafu asasi ife. Sasa kuna wakati tuna changamoto. Kwa mfano sisi asasi yetu inatetea watu 100 kwa siku. Watu 100 wanakuja wenye kesi. Sasa unawaza hawa wateja 100 leo taasisi kifungwa wateja 100 kwa siku wanakuja. Sio kwamba wanakuja kwa wakati, ni kwa siku wateja 100 tunahudumia wastani. Wakati mwingine 120, wakati mwingine 80, lakini average ya 100. Kwa hiyo unawaza wa 100 nao watetea kila siku kesi zao, maana yake shirika kifungwa leo, maana wote watapoteza kesi zao. Kwa mwezi ni wateja wangapi? Kwa mwaka ni wateja wangapi? Kwa hiyo ni changamoto ambayo inapata. Sasa nimalizie tu mheshimiwa mwenyekiti kwa kusema fursa au tufanyeje sasa ili tuweze kufanikisha. Ni kwamba round table discussions, majadiliano ya pamoja ya kuelewa ya kati ya hizo asasi za kiraia na walioko madarakani. Lakini vile vile kuonyesha mchango wa asasi za kiraia kwenye maendeleo. Mimi ninalipa milioni 100 kwa mwezi kodi ya wafanyakazi pay milioni 100 kila mwezi ninalipa. Kila mwezi na sign cheki ya milioni 100. Lakini hiyo ni asasi moja. Asasi ziko zaidi ya 8,000. Kwa hiyo ina maana mchango wetu ni mkubwa sana kwenye maendeleo. Lakini pia hao wateja 100 ninaohudumia pia wangeenda kwa mawakili wa kujitegemea, labda wangelipa hela nyingi ambazo kesi zingepotea pia, labda kwa sababu wangekosa kuwalipa. Kwa hiyo ile tunavyosaidia watu tuweze kuionyesha kwamba ni mchango katika maendeleo. Nikimsaidia mama mjane ambaye amenyang'anywa shamba, kanyang'anywa shamba lake, amekosa pa kulima, maana yake ninamsaidia, amerudishiwa shamba lake, maana yake nimesaidia hata kuwa maskini tena kwa sababu atakuwa anaendelea kulima. Lakini la mwisho kufanya kazi kwa pamoja na hao wenye mamlaka na kufanya na pia kuchagiza mabadiliko ya sera, sheria na katiba ili kuweza kutambua hii sekta ya tatu ambayo sekta ya kwanza ni serikali, sekta ya pili ni private sector, sekta ya tatu ni asasi ya kiraia. Bila mafiga hayo matatu nchi haiwezi kuendelea. Asante sana.
Thank you so much for another very nice presentation. Umetuelimisha kuhusu maana ya asasi za kiraia, changamoto ambazo umezipata kule. Mojawapo ni kuonekana wewe ni mpinzani, kuonekana wewe sio mzalendo au unatumika, kufungiwa kufanya kazi ambayo ndio certificate uliyopewa kufanya hiyo kazi kile unazuiwa. Lakini pia umeambia fursa zilizopo, round table discussions, which means keep on engaging. Continue engaging with the government, continue engaging with the powers that be until kieleweke, mpaka kieleweke, si ndio? Muendelee kuongea. But also show your contribution